So we left off last week with the Israeli victory in the War of Independence. So Israel won, and certainly in retrospect, we say it was a handy victory. So, but it was a costly victory, right? 6,000 or so killed in a population of about 600,000, which is like 1%, which is significant in a war. The Israeli army, although it won, was not yet the finely honed fighting machine it would become, right? A lot of things they had managed to do were sort of ad hoc and certainly worked out well. And it's an interesting thing, like, when you look at Theodor Herzl's vision of the Jewish state or the Jewish state, seeing like how many things he kind of got wrong, right? And one of them was his ideas as to what the army of the Judenstaat would be, right? He imagined that the Judenstaat would be sort of a neutral power guaranteed by all of the great powers, and its military would be largely ceremonial, like the army of the Jews would like serve as guards at the holy sites and run around in fancy uniforms and so forth. Well, that obviously didn't happen, and Israel needs to create now a formal standing army. They adopt a reserve model, right? Universal conscription, and fairly universal, right? I mean, particularly in 1949, Israel is fairly unique in drafting not just men but women. At that point, the number of exemptions given for those engaged in Talmud study was extremely small. I think just 200 at first. Arabs were exempted from this, but and women, for the most part, even during the War of Independence, very quickly were moved into non-combat roles, right? So there were certainly some women who were involved in fighting, particularly before the war and in the first months of the war. Most of our women were pushed into combat roles, which is starting to change now to some extent. But look, even that, the fact is, understand modern militaries, the bulk of the military is non-combat, right? In any Western style military, you have a relatively small number of combat troops, and you have a huge logistical train that is supplying them, that is transporting them, that is providing services for them, that's doing a wide variety of things, providing intelligence, air support, whatever it may be. And Israel has been able to maintain, because of the role of women as even in the non-combat roles, dedicate a far larger percentage of its male population to combat roles than they would in another situation. And then the reserve model really is going to allow Israel to operate a military that's much more, again, combat ready than a lot of countries, particularly in that area, but also really is going to shape Israeli military doctrine, right? And we're going to see this very much in 1967, right? That, the Israeli military is primarily made up of reservists, well-trained reservists, right? Unlike in a lot of countries. But what that means is the Israeli army has to fight quickly, right? They don't have the luxury of being able to maintain. I mean, look, you think about the United States when we, invade Iraq. We call up the reserves, we call up the National Guard. Most Americans were still largely untouched by that call-up. Most American industries are largely untouched by that call-up. In Israel, if they have to go to full mobilization, right, the whole country is kind of going to shut down and is going to be caught, particularly back then when things were not particularly automated, the economy is going to grind to a standstill. So, Israel develops doctrines that really call for attacking quickly, attacking by surprise, attacking with great ferocity, and ending the war as quickly as possible, because they can't dilly-dally when it comes to this stuff. The ad hoc army of the war needs to become professionalized. It needs to become resupplied. The Israelis begin to build new types of units, right? You see on the left here, Ben-Gurion dealing with paratroopers, right? The guy to the right of him, Tom Bowden, was a British non-Jewish paratrooper who'd served in Machal, and Ben-Gurion later asked him to stay when the war is over and develop Israeli paratroop abilities, right? So dealing with that. The guy on the right was originally named Gotthard Gutglas, but he's better known as Uzi Gal, the inventor of the Uzi, which is a submachine gun you see in his right hand. Which again, it's just got like one of the things that Israel has in the beginning is a lot of these kind of, self-taught tinkerers, right? He liked taking guns apart. He liked putting things back together. He develops the Uzi submachine gun, which is the first sort of really mass-produced weapon made by the Israelis. It begins in around 1952. It is the sort of beginning, really, of of sort of the modern Israeli arms industry in that sense. And Israel, though, is not yet a country, though, that can produce a lot of heavy weapons, right? They don't have the ability to produce airplanes. They don't have the ability to produce tanks. They had managed to scrape together, as you recall last week, an armored force during the War of Independence, largely by sort of poaching scrap yards all around Europe and even as far away as the Philippines. But if they're going to participate in modern warfare, they need more tanks. They need better tanks. You're going to need modern aircraft and all of this stuff. Unfortunately for them, until the mid-50s or so, the big suppliers they would have looked for, the England, the French, English, the French, the U.S., had to some extent imposed an arms embargo on the region. I say to some extent because in some cases they'd already signed agreements with other countries. The U.S., I think, an agreement with Saudi Arabia to sell them weapons. The British were providing weapons to the Jordanians and Iraqis and Egyptians, the French to the Syrians. So when the embargo was declared, these countries like, well, we're not going to sell arms to the Middle East, except those weapons you've already agreed to sell to the Middle East. While Israel had a couple of years earlier enjoyed the support of the Soviet Union, as we're going to see, that disappears even before the end of the War of Independence. So the Israelis, for the first few years, are really sort of struggling to find the weapons that they need. But the most immediate military problem facing the country is not a war with a neighboring state. It's Palestinian Arab infiltrators. And this is one of these controversial issues that Israeli military history and Israeli history is full of. Even before the war ends, you have Arabs beginning to try to return to their homes, right? So as we discussed last week, there are some 700,000 Palestinian Arabs who, for whatever reason, leave their homes during the War of Independence. Most are not expelled. They leave because there's a war, they're threatened, right? All good reasons to leave. It's a war after all. There were certainly tens of thousands who were expelled by the Israelis. But even before the end, some of them begin trying to make their way back home. And in the same way that there wasn't really like sort of a fixed rule for who gets expelled, right? But a lot was left up to local commanders. The same thing applies for returns, right? Considerable local autonomy seems to have been exercised. Some commanders are more generous in who they let back in. It seems that in some cases, commanders are more willing to readmit Christians who had fled to Lebanon, perhaps because, again, they sensed Christian Arabs would be less problematic, or because they hoped as well to, make some ties with the Lebanese Christians. But there wasn't any particular policy there, and which also creates more confusion for the Palestinians, right? So, for the next 6 years or so, you're going to have Palestinians trying to come back across the border, some of whom would have known that there were other Palestinians who were readmitted for whatever reason. Although, again, after 1950 or so, the Israeli government becomes much more strict and unwilling to readmit anybody, and including, as we're going to see, it's a problem for actually Israeli Arabs as well, who never sort of left Israel. So infiltration came in two basic forms, right? Most common were refugees who are trying to go back home, right? Either they want to move back home to their villages, they want to reclaim property, they want to tend to crops, they want to tend to livestock. There's something, I think really moving about this and sad, right? I mean, I'm not a farmer, but the connection that farmers have to their land and their soil and all this other stuff. And you have these people who, basically whatever happened that brought them to this situation, want to go back to their land, want to take care of their trees, want to take care of their fields, and can't. You can add to this Bedouin, right, who, didn't really pay much attention to borders beforehand, are not going to pay much attention to borders now, and feel like, well, they're used to moving back and forth between Arab countries or Arab provinces or the Ottoman Empire and British Egypt, and they're going to do the same thing now. But you also have intentionally violent infiltrators as well. Less common, but there were combatants who were going across the border to murder, to steal, to conduct sabotage. Most of this seemed to be, local. There wasn't necessarily, at least for the first 4 years or so, sort of large-scale organizing of these kinds of attacks, but that will come. And you see here some numbers. 1952, 16,000 cases of infiltration. 1953 drops to 7,000, 54, 4,600, 55, smaller. And the reason why these numbers are getting smaller is because, to some extent, the Israelis are becoming far more rigorous in their responses. And for good reason, right? I mean, again, you can look at the numbers. This was a real problem, right? Dozens of Jews are being killed in the course of these attacks, primarily civilians. And it's worth pointing out that even with Arab infiltrators who weren't coming to necessarily cause harm, if you've got a Arab farmer who's going back to check his crops and he gets surprised by some Jews, it's not unlikely that there's going to be a gunfight or something like that. So there's a lot of things.
Yeah. Can I ask one question?
Yeah, sure.
In this infiltration, what legal provisions were made at that point in the very young Jewish state for Arabs to actually return, Arabs who felt they had to stay away from hostilities, but then wanted to return to their land? Was all of their land expropriated and given?
Yeah, so it's again, this goes back to sort of what I was suggesting last week, which is there wasn't at first a kind of national policy. That comes a little later, but what you're going to have is the Israeli government deciding that, and it goes kind of beyond the purview. That's like, first of all, you're going to have Arab villages and Arab towns and Arab homes, which are given to Jewish refugees, right? So in some cases, those homes don't exist anymore, right? If you're an Arab who fled Sfat or fled Haifa, right, you got 700,000 Palestinians who are leaving. In the immediate wake of that war, and even before the war was over, you've got 600,000 Jews from Europe coming in, and you begin to have hundreds of thousands of Jews coming in from the Muslim world. And so in many cases, there's no place for these Arabs to go back to. In other cases, the Israeli government is going to destroy villages, in part precisely to avoid the infiltration issue, right? I mean, so, you're going to have places where the Israeli government is going to decide, we want this area to be Arabrine, right? Pardon the expression. And we're going to destroy this village. And that's not just something that affects Arab refugees who fled. This is also affecting Israeli Arabs, right? Because if you've got an Israeli Arab living in a village that the Israeli government decides is going to be destroyed, that guy's got to move to some other place. So there is no provision for Israeli Arabs, much less foreign Arabs, by Israeli terms, to come back. Israeli Arabs are living under martial law for several decades. So even within Israel itself, their movement is actually pretty tightly controlled. And you're going to find actually cases of Israeli Arabs who never left during the war, who are actually going to be expelled by the Israelis because they're going to be caught trying to go back to their villages. And depending on where they're caught, as far as Israel is concerned, they're infiltrators and kick him to Lebanon or kick him to Syria. Right. So, which is one of those things where, as a guy in the 21st century, like, okay, I guess I'm glad some of this stuff happened, but doesn't change the fact that it was tragic and horrible and brutal and oppressive and right? All these other things. The Israeli government, the IDF, sees returning refugees and infiltrators as a threat. It is a tactical threat, right? Because they do engage in violence or can engage in violence. But more importantly, it's the strategic threat, right? If you open the door, right, and let all of them back, right, Israel's demographic security and its security in general is going to diminish, right? I mean, if 700,000 Palestinian Arabs return to, right, the Jewish state, right, it's less of a Jewish state, it's less of a secure state. These are people who can't be trusted, they're fifth columnists, whatever it may be. So, the question about letting back small numbers of infiltrators, individual infiltrators, is caught up in this much larger question, right? And to some extent, the Israeli government just decides better not to let anybody back, because that resolves the issue entirely. And the Israeli response is becoming increasingly aggressive. A variety of sources, including Israeli sources, suggest that both soldiers and the newly established border police, the reason why the border police were established is right because of this, are engaging in violence. There's killing of prisoners, there's beating of prisoners, right? Some people get caught, they get beat up, kicked back over the border. Again, expulsion even of Israeli Arabs trying to return to their villages. So, to some extent, the approach of the IDF here is that the harsher we are, the less we will have to deal with this stuff in the future, right? If we make it clear you're not going to get to your home and you're risking your life doing so, right, this will eventually reduce the number of infiltrators. And the problem of violent infiltrators becomes magnified in 1952. Big thing happens in the Arab world in 1952. Anybody know what it is?
Is it Nasser?
Ah,
And is it the United Arab Republic?
Yeah, good. Okay, Nasser. Okay, so King Farouk is overthrown, and a group of army officers in Egypt takes over the government. And Nasser was only a colonel at the time, maybe a lieutenant colonel. So he does not become the public face of it yet. There's a general who is like made the figurehead leader, General Najib. But Nasser is really the guy behind it. So a little backstory. The failure to defeat Israel was a disaster for the leadership of the Arab world, right? I mean, here you had people who led their country into war, big promises as to what they were going to achieve. I mean, how tough can it be to beat a bunch of Jews, right? I mean, it shouldn't be that difficult. And they failed, right? They failed in humiliating ways. And some Arab leaders are going to try to make accommodations with Israel. Maybe I'll teach another class on Arab-Israeli peace efforts. It'll be a shorter class than the wars. But for the most part, there's a lot of angry rhetoric. But there's a lot of instability, right? If you look in Syria, for example, 1949, the chief of staff, Hosni Zaim, conducts a coup, right? 3 or 4 months later, right, he's killed in another coup. In the early 1950s, King Abdullah of Jordan, who in both cases, these were guys who wanted to make peace with Israel, is assassinated. So, and even when new governments take over up until Nasser, it's kind of more of the same, like, right. So you kill this king, a new king takes over. You kill this kind of like conservative military figure, new conservative military takes over. This bureaucrat goes, a new bureaucrat comes in. Nasser is different, right? Nasser is a much more dynamic figure. He is a figure calling for change, right? A king is toppled and a people's, sort of revolutionary movement takes over. Nasser was a longtime opponent of British rule. He had served in the 48 war, ending in what was called the Fallujah Pocket, which was a group of the Egyptian army, which was surrounded by Israeli forces, but on Israeli territory when the war ended. So the Egyptian army in the Fallujah Pocket they were like the one kind of saving grace of Egyptian arms, right? Because they had not surrendered. So Nasser had a a certain degree of credibility as a fighter for Egyptian independence, as an opponent of imperialism, as an opponent of Zionism, as a fighter. And I'm going to say, look, Nasser is actually also a pretty charming guy. I'm gonna play here a video of Nasser from a decade later or so. But it's good to see that, like, right, the guy had presence. So I'm gonna play this. Let me stop the sharing and start it again, because I think I didn't set the things for sound. And share screen, one slide, share sound. Okay. So you can read the subtitles there. It's actually pretty good speech.
في سنة 53
Just can you hear it all fine? Everybody?
Sure, yeah, it's good.
كنا نريد فعلا مخلصين ان احنا نتعاون مع الاخوان المسلمين.
Also, can you hear
على
it?
ان
Even though it's Arabic, but just the laughter and stuff. Can you hear the sound as well?
Yeah, I'm mostly hearing
I hear it.
Yeah, that's
I'm
fine.
hearing it, yeah.
الطريق الصحيح والطريق السليم. وقابلت المرشد العام للاخوان المسلمين وقعد وطلب مطالب. طلب ايه؟ اول حاجة قال لي يجب ان تقيم الحجاب في مصر وتخلي كل واحدة تمشي في الشارع تلبس طرحة. كل واحدة تمشي. وانا قلت له يعني اذا الواحد قال هذا الكلام بيقولوا رجعنا لايام الحاكم بامر الله اللي كان بيخلي الناس ما يمشوش بالنهار ويمشوا بالليل. انا في رايي ان كل واحد في بيته هو اللي ينفذ هذا الكلام. فقال لي لا، انت باعتبارك الحاكم مسؤول. قلت له يا استاذ، انت ليك بنت في كليه الطب مش لابسه طرحه ولا حاجه، ما لبستهاش طرحه ليه؟ فكنت انت اذا كنت انت مش قادر تلبس بنت واحده اللي هي بنتك طرحه، عايزنا ننزل نلبس 10 مليون طرح في البلد؟
Yeah, so look, say what you will about him. He could deliver a speech. He could lead a room. And again, it's what is this alphabet? So that's fine. Why when you think about the type of speeches that probably these people are used to hearing, right? He was a commanding presence. He's a again, charming figure, right? All these other odds and ends, who was a mix of a proud Arab nationalist, a modernist, somebody who was bringing in new ideas. Hold on, I see the problem. Right, all of these things. Okay, wait a minute. Hold on. Can you see the screen? Can you see the PowerPoint thing?
Yes.
Okay. All right. Why can I not make it work? Okay. There we go. All right. Hold on. Share. All right. There we go. All right. So, and in fact, he had some encounters with Israelis after the 48 war. Who were actually pretty impressed by him, right? He had this encounter with Yitzhak Rabin, when both of them were, again, Rabin and he were, maybe Rabin was a general at the time, but Nasser was, again, a colonel. Nasser was sitting next to me. He looked at the emblem of the Palmach and asked me what it meant, and I explained. Then he told me the war we were fighting is the wrong war against the wrong enemy at the wrong time. And I remember that because he didn't say it in private. And I believe at the time we were very close to peace, and what happened, and he went the opposite direction. I guess the road is much longer than we would have wished. In Nasser's account, we were well received. We met, this is from his diaries, we were well received. We met with the Jewish commander who said he wishes to stop the bloodshed and that our situation is desperate. He asked for us to surrender. The Egyptian commander objected and he refused and asked to pull out to Gaza Rafah, but the Jews refused and said they agree on one condition, that the Egyptian army withdraw from all of Palestine. We asked for the evacuation of the wounded to Gaza. They rejected and said, we're willing to give you the medicine you need. They offered us orange juice, oranges, sandwiches, chocolate, candy, and biscuits. Shlomo Goren, later on the chief rabbi of the IDF and chief rabbi of Israel, he had a meeting with Nasser in 1949 to retrieve Jewish bodies. He also said Nasser treated him very respectfully and had his men salute and all this stuff. So, he's a complex figure, but now he is the commander. He's the leader of the most populous, most important Arab country. And an Arab country which is striving to assert itself in the world, not just in relationship to Israel, but assert itself in relationship, even more importantly, to Great Britain, right, which had been dominating Egyptian politics in various capacities since the early 1880s. And his most immediate goals seemed to be getting rid of the British, who were still occupying the Canal Zone at this time period. And he's trying to establish Egypt as not just an Arab leader, there's certainly that, but as a world leader, right? So, there's an effort here in the beginnings of the Cold War to establish sort of a neutral bloc, right? Countries like Yugoslavia and India, which are trying to create sort of a new grouping of countries that are not going to be allied with the Soviets.
Yeah, it was non-aligned. That was the term.
Yeah,
right?
That's it. Yes, good. Thank you. Yeah, not neutral, non-aligned bloc. Thank you. And to that extent, there he is going to try and distance himself from the West. He's going to try and distance himself or take a more aggressive approach to Israel, because again, he's got two things. On the one hand, right, non-alignment, right? That means you got to separate yourself from the West. Leader of the Pan-Arab movement, that means a more aggressive tone with Israel, and these two things are going to intersect. And pursuant to that, Nasser becomes a much more aggressive figure and begins to create an organized campaign of what are called Fedayeen, right? These are like before the PLO, you have the Fedayeen. These are the actual like raiders who are organized into military groups to try and raid from Gaza, but also from Jordan to attack Israel.
What does it actually translate to, Fedayeen? Is it an Arabic word?
Yeah, it's an Arabic word. It means like, I don't know, the sacrificers or something like that. I'm drawing a blank, sorry.
Okay.
Yeah, but something tells me that within 10 seconds of Googling, you will find all you need to know.
Okay.
Yeah, sorry. And right, here's a quote from 55. Egypt has decided to dispatch her heroes, the disciples of Pharaoh and the sons of Islam, and they will cleanse the land of Palestine. There will be no peace on Israel's border because we demand vengeance, and vengeance is Israel's death. So on the one hand, it's your basic, sort of anti-Israel rhetoric, but there's an interesting thing here about Egypt's place in the world, right? The disciples of Pharaoh and the sons of Islam. So, Egypt develops its own kind of unique nationalism in the 19th century, right? It's sort of the first Arab country to really be independent, right? Even though it was nominally part of the Ottoman Empire, it had developed autonomy starting in the 1830s or so. And there's a long sort of internal discussion in Egypt as to what Egypt is. On the one hand, we're Arabs, we're Muslims, but we're also heirs to a history that transcends Islam, right? That existed long before Islam, and a lot more than other Arab countries for whom, the beginnings of their history is like Muslim conquest. Egypt maintained this kind of identity as something greater than just a Muslim or Arab country. Anyway, with the Fedayeen representing a far greater threat than what we've seen before, Israel develops a far more organized and violent response, right? The feeling was that Israeli border guards, Israeli soldiers were not well trained for dealing with this kind of thing. And Ariel Sharon is tasked with forming a unit, right, that is going to be specially trained to fight the Fedayeen, right? They organized from the paratroopers, Unit 101. Sharon is one of these guys we sort of mentioned before, who had been a Palmachnik, who'd served in these various sort of militias before the war and received this training, and now is going to put this stuff to use. And here's a quote from Ben Gurion: "The Palestinians must learn they will pay a high price for Israeli lives." And Sharon trains these men hard. Again, puts to use a lot of the doctrine that we've spoken about with the special night squads and Palmach and so forth. It wasn't Israel's first commando unit, the Shayetet 13, which is still like Israel's equivalent of the Navy SEALs, had been around since 1949. But that was very small, largely involved again with naval operations. Unit 101 is going to be the Israeli Army's first real commando unit, and begin to do the kind of things that we sort of glamorize and mythologize regarding the IDF, and some other things that we don't glamorize or mythologize, such as the attack on Kibyat. So this is one of these sort of controversial moments in Israeli military history. October 1953, an Israeli woman and her two children were murdered by Fedayeen operating out of Jordan. And Unit 101 is sent into the West Bank. Again, at that point, Jordan claimed it, to a village called Kibyat. Several dozen Arabs are killed. A number of Jordanian soldiers are killed. But most of the people killed are civilians. And the Israeli government's response is, well, these killings were unintentional, right? They just went in to blow up buildings, but the women and children hid in the buildings. But in subsequent decades, evidence would come out of Israeli archives showing that the unit was sent in with instructions to engage in maximum killing, right? The idea was, we're going to go in and kill a bunch of Jordanian civilians because that's going to be the thing that gets the Jordanian army to actually begin controlling its border. And it's one of those things which justify, not justify. The fact is, it was murder, but it also was effective murder, because in the wake of the Kibyat massacre, Jordanians did do much more to secure the border. So, it's worth keeping in mind that the history of Israel is a lot more complicated than a lot of Jewish schools have made out to be. And the infamy that attaches to Unit 101 led to its dissolution, but not its disappearance, right? That these guys were at this point the best soldiers in the IDF. They're merged in with the paratroopers, which Sharon takes over, and begins training and providing the same kind of doctrine and skills to the paratroop units. And while he's commanding Gaza, the paratroopers conduct a series of very successful operations in Gaza, which humiliates the Egyptian army, right? They're attacking Egyptian military bases, they're attacking police stations, and then when the Egyptian army comes to reinforce, they ambush them. In a series of raids, not over a course of a few months in 1955, nearly 200 Egyptian soldiers, 54, excuse me, nearly 200 Egyptian soldiers and police are killed at the cost of probably just a few Israeli soldiers, which is a humiliating blow to Nasser's status, right? He is trying to present himself as the great hero who is going to, defeat the Israelis, and instead he's proving himself unable to actually defend Egyptian territory from the Israelis. So Nasser's step then is to strike back the way he can, which is to close off the Straits of Tiran to Israeli shipping, and we'll speak more about that in a minute, and to sign a major arms deal with the Soviets to begin receiving weapons from the Czechs. And if you remember last week, right, the Czechs in 48 had been supplying Israel. Some big things that happened since then. Some are internal. Right. One is what's going on in the Soviet Union, right? And it's a fascinating story, right? Prior to the creation of Israel, Soviet Jews were not targeted as a national group by the Soviet government, right? Doesn't mean there wasn't persecution of Jews who engage in certain religious practices, or Jews who belong to certain political movements, like certain Zionist parties and so forth. But unlike a lot of national groups in the Soviet Union, Jews did not face the kind of mass deportations, expulsions, imprisonment as Jews and other groups had. And anybody take a guess, what was the reason? Why were Jews not seen as problematic in the way that other groups were? Anyone still there?
Yeah, I'm here, but
Yeah.
you're saying 48 being before and after?
Before 48. So the answer is this: Jews were distinct in the Soviet Union as not having another national entity that could claim their allegiance.
Okay.
Right.
Gotcha.
So Poles, Finns, Latvians, Lithuanians, Germans, Chechen, you name it, right? There's a whole variety of groups that were viewed as suspicious because their loyalties were viewed as directed more towards some other group, or they could be used by some other group. Jews weren't. And then Israel is created. And this picture on the left, in that circle, is Golda Meir, right? First Israeli ambassador to the Soviet Union, right? Native Russian speaker, as a lot of the leadership of Israel were at that point. And she goes to Israel. I think that's her outside the Great Synagogue in Moscow, being mobbed by Jews. And these are scenes that the Soviets were not prepared for, right? And there's even this moment where Vyacheslav Molotov's wife, Molotov was the foreign minister for many years under Stalin. His wife, an old Bolshevik, a Jew, comes up to Golda Meir and says, "Ich bin euch a jüdische Tochter." Right, I'm also a Jewish daughter, right? So for Stalin, suddenly, and again, it started a little earlier because of the enthusiasm of Zionism. Suddenly, Soviet Jews are going to be viewed with a certain degree of suspicion, but also Israel is going to be viewed as not a way for the Soviets to gain a foothold in the Middle East. It's going to be viewed as a way for this foreign ideology, Zionism, to gain a foothold in the Soviet Union. And at the same time that that's happening, the whole sort of map of the Middle East is changing. Right, where in 1948 the Soviets might have looked at Israel as the sort of best option for a Soviet foothold in the Middle East. But as more and more countries begin to break free from British rule and French rule and challenge the imperial order, right, by the 1950s, if you're the Soviets, forget about Israel, right? The Syrians want weapons. The Egyptians want weapons. There are new countries forming in North Africa. There are rebel groups fighting in Algeria against the French, right, who want Soviet weapons. Right? There's a whole lot of groups and people in the Middle East, other than this tiny little Israeli state, who are looking to the Soviets for leadership. So, right, if you're the Soviets, right, the Israelis have lost a lot of their value. The Israelis see the Egyptians getting these weapons in 1955 and begin to make their own plans for war, right? In their view, Egypt with a new tranche of Soviet weapons is going to be a danger. Egypt under Nasser in particular, with a new tranche of Soviet weapons, is going to be extremely dangerous. The assumption is that they wouldn't be able to fully integrate these weapon systems, new tanks and planes and artillery into their use until the end of 1956. So the Israelis are looking at 1956 as sort of the year where they need to take action against Egypt. And again, as you noted, it's part of Israeli doctrine, you've got to strike first and strike fast. And this is not the first military action that Israel was contemplating against its neighbors, right? And there's a tendency on the part of Zionists and anti-Zionists alike to sort of think of Israel as like a monolith, like Israel wants blank, right? If you're a Zionist, like Israel only wants good things. If you're anti-Zionist, Israel only wants bad things. And the fact is, Israel is a country with a lot of people and a lot of political parties, and they want different things, right? And the fact is, in the Israeli government, there were hawks and doves, just like lots of governments, right? And there were those who wanted Israel to work on developing itself and make peace and all this other stuff. And then you've got hawks like Ben-Gurion, who are looking to what they saw as Israel's advantage, right? Ben-Gurion had contemplated invasion of Lebanon, hoping to seize land south of the Litani River, right? And this was designed both to improve Israel's water resources, right? Seize the Litani River, which would give Israel access to its water, and also help install a more sympathetic Christian government. Keep that in mind, because it's going to come back again in the 1970s and 80s. There have been schemes to attack Jordan and take part of all of the West Bank, though those fell aside because of Jordan's alliance with Britain. So the Israelis had been contemplating war with other countries, but not with Egypt. Egypt didn't have any land that Israel really wanted, right? But it is worth to discuss the idea, like the mythology that, quote, Israel always wants peace. And look, I teach in Jewish schools. It's something you hear all the time. And number one, it's problematic because it's a truism, right? Of course, Israel wants peace, right? Who doesn't want peace? Very generally, countries do, right? There are certainly exceptions to that, but as a rule, countries want peace on their terms, right? Which may not be acceptable to some other country, right? Generally speaking, Israeli peace efforts have been built around keeping what Israel's already conquered, right? So 1949 comes along, the Syrians offer a peace deal, right, in exchange for access to the Kinneret and to the Jordan, and the Israelis saying, no, if you want peace, we can make peace. After we make peace, then we can discuss anything else, but we're not giving up land we took. Same thing happens in the Negev, right, other places as well. Arab countries, which when they're interested in talking peace, tend to want to regain what they just lost. And this is where a lot of the sort of inability comes in, right? If you've got one party whose bottom line is we're going to keep what we've conquered, another party's bottom line is we've got to regain what we just lost, going to have trouble making that work. And another problem with this truism is it's a false truism, right? Why should Israel always want peace, right? Is peace necessarily better than some of the other things that Israel wants, right? Israel wants water resources. Israel wants access to the Gulf of Aqaba. Israel wants places for Jewish population growth. Israel wants more secure borders, right? And so as far as that goes, it's more useful to think of Israel as a country that makes decisions like any other country. And very often Israel is going to make decisions that security plus, right, something else, security plus water resources, security plus better land, security plus more room for expansion is preferable to peace that would cost them what they see as some of those other things. At any rate, Egypt is different from Lebanon and Jordan, right? In those cases, Israel was basically an aggressive war against countries that didn't really threaten it. In this case, they see Egypt as a threat, and they feel they need to act on this threat before it becomes too dangerous. And also very important in the case of Egypt, the Israelis are going to find themselves with a powerful ally, right? The ally in question being the French. And what motivated them was, there are a few things. French leadership at the time, through the 50s, was generally made up of former resistance fighters or, people who served in the Free French armies, who generally sympathized with Israel. And so did the general population at that time, right? There was this sort of hot moment there where the French and Israelis saw themselves as having a sort of same goals and enemies, including the British, right? I mean, the French had their own resentments against the British, who had sort of driven them out of the Middle East. The Israelis obviously had their issues with the British, and especially as the French are sort of reduced in status in Lebanon and Syria. They're going to see Israel as a useful place to restore their authority in the Levant, right? They will give them a base of operations in the Levant. And from 1954 on, there is a new factor, which is that France is fighting a war in Algeria. And take a guess who is supporting the Algerian rebels? right?
Nasser in Egypt, probably.
Yeah, good, right? So the enemy of mine is my friend, right? There's a whole bunch of factors here that are going to push the Israelis and the French together. Shimon Peres is working tirelessly through the 1950s to cement this relationship, right? He's really the sort of father of these negotiations and the partnership that's developed at this time.
And all the mirages, I can see that you have it on the right. Yeah.
Yeah, right. And the Israelis had bought dribs and drabs before, but 1954 is really, and this is before even, Nasser buys his weapons. Already the Israelis have made a big arms purchase from the French, AMX-13 light tanks, some upgunned Sherman tanks, Mirages, and some other odds and ends there. So they're really giving the Israelis a kind of upgrade that they had not had in real terms since the end of the war. And again, the plan is, especially with more weapons coming in 1955, to make use of this stuff before 1956. And 56 is a bunch of things coming together that produce what happens, right? King Hussein dismisses British officers from the Arab Legion. This is probably the best unit in the Arab world, again, trained and staffed by British officers. To some extent, British policy in the Middle East had been built around maintaining, right, their good relations with the Arab allies they still had. King Hussein, who had recently took over after his grandfather was assassinated in front of him, which probably messed him up quite a bit when it came to peacemaking, decides that he's got to get rid of these people. And it's an interesting thing, right? The Transjordan had been a pretty stable monarchy led by Emir Abdullah, right, from the Hashemite family in Arabia. Most of the population were these Bedouin who were pretty loyal to his family. When he took over the West Bank, right, in 1948-49, on the one hand, he doubles the size of the country, he greatly multiplies the population, he takes East Jerusalem, but he also now creates a population that isn't loyal to him, that has their own incentives and imperatives when it comes to Israel. And so, the Jordanian royal family kind of becomes hostages to their success, right? Emir Abdullah, or King Abdullah at that point, is assassinated by a Palestinian. Efforts that he'd made to try and make peace with Israel were thwarted both by sort of Israeli unwillingness to make certain concessions, but also by the unwillingness of his own politicians who were increasingly supported by Palestinians to make certain concessions either.
Just out of curiosity, Abdullah was Hussein's father.
A grandfather. So he had two sons, one of whom was like too pro-British, one was too anti-British. I think that was actually Hussein's father, who was the heir. And the British arranged for him to be like declared mentally incompetent. And then
it passed a generation. I understand.
There'd been a coup in Syria, and the new government decided to begin seeking arms from the Soviet bloc there, from the Czechs. So things are moving away from the French and the British. They'd been providing weapons to Syria beforehand. And July 26 in Egypt, the biggest event of 56, right in the Middle East, sort of takes place. Arguably at least until October, and that's the nationalization of the Suez Canal. So Nasser had negotiated for the British to leave the canal zone, right? But the Suez Canal was still owned by a sort of conglomerate of British and French investors. And in one fell swoop, the canal is nationalized, no longer belongs to these British and French investors. And along with that, Nasser also has been tightening up the blockade on the Straits of Tiran, right, in the wake of Israel's raids. He says, well, you know what? We're going to blockade Israel. They can't use the Suez Canal. Ships going to Israel, they already couldn't use the Suez Canal, but even ships going to Israel, we're not going to let through the Suez Canal. We're not going to let ships traveling to Israel travel through the Straits of Tiran. And 56 was also the year that the port of Eilat was supposed to fully open. It existed, had been opened in 52, but only about 10 ships had passed through in the previous 4 years because it was too small. So, from the Israeli perspective, closing the Straits of Tiran in 56 was a far more of an attack on Israel. Egypt was violating international treaties on international waterways. It was violating UN Security Council resolutions regarding the Suez Canal. So the Israelis felt not unreasonable that they had a justification for war, as did the French and English, who were looking for a way to get rid of Nasser anyway, and whose investors had lost a lot of money. I will say again, Nasser could be a funny guy. He actually did compensate the investors who held stock in the Suez Canal Company, but compensated them based on the value of their shares at the end of the day's trading on the day he nationalized it, which I have to say is a pretty funny thing to do. So the French and Israelis, they begin making plans to do something. The French and the British, they begin making their own plans. So over the course of the summer in 1956, you've got sort of like two separate tracks of negotiations taking place, right? The French are talking about the British about some sort of great power intervention, and the French are talking with the Israelis about the Israelis playing a role. It's not until October that all the parties meet in Sèvres, and I guess outside of Paris there, and they come up with a sort of secret protocol as to what's going to happen, right? And the basic idea is this, right? Israel is going to launch an attack on Egypt, right? Israeli forces launch in the evening of 29 October, a large-scale attack on the Egyptian forces with the aim of reaching the canal zone the following day. When the English and French hear about this, right, their governments will issue an ultimatum calling on right, both sides to halt all acts of war, withdraw troops from 10 miles from the canal, and calling for Egypt to accept temporary occupation of key positions on the canal, right, to guarantee safe passage through the canal, to make sure that the canal remains open, right? It's all a pretext, right, for the French and British to intervene. And, in their view, one of two things happens. If the Egyptians agree to this, which they doubt they will, well, then the French and British will invade Egypt. And if the Egyptians won't invade, they'll just occupy it. And if they don't agree to it, then they'll invade, right? Either way, they see this as the means to topple Nasser, right? That Nasser will not be able to survive sort of the humiliation of an Israeli of defeat at the hands of Israel, or an occupation by the English and French that will sort of take over the country basically. But it calls for the Anglo-French forces to act right the morning of October 31st, like 2 days after the Israeli invasion. Now, the campaign is usually marked as beginning on October 29th, but the shooting really began on the 28th, right, with a secret Israeli operation called Operation Tarnagol, Rooster, I guess, to kill this guy, Abdel Hakim Amer. So he is one of the members of the military officers who had taken over the government with Nasser. He and Anwar Sadat, both seen here. I know they look like a jazz combo, but they had been together at the military academy in Egypt in the 1930s. They'd served together. They'd planned together. He was at this point the defense minister and basically sort of the marshal in charge of the Egyptian army and their military. And the Israelis had intelligence that he was going to be flying from Damascus to Egypt on the 28th, along with a group of general staff officers from the Egyptian army. And this is seen as a tremendous opportunity to decapitate the Egyptian military, right? This Czech transport plane, an Ilyushin, whatever it is flying along. Some newly acquired Israeli fighter jets just got from the British, intercept the plane. They shoot it down. Everybody on board is killed. Amer was not on board the plane, but that didn't mean that they didn't kill somebody of value, because they did kill No, so that's not true. Buddy Holly was not on the plane. I just thought that would be one hell of a plot twist. No, Amer turned out didn't take that flight. He flew on a later flight. But over a dozen high-ranking officers were on the plane and went down. And the Israelis shot it down before the plane could report what was happening. So the Egyptians were completely unaware that this was taking place. Right? In fact, they were so unaware that they actually called upon the British to assist them in finding a plane that had gone down and had crashed. So they have no idea that war has broken out. And they also are not really sure the next morning, because even when the Israeli attack takes place, the Israelis made use of their old World War II surplus P-51 Mustangs. Kind of cool. They were supposed to fly and destroy the telephone wires and other communication lines in Sinai. And they had special hooks that were supposed to do that, but the hooks didn't work. So these planes came down about 12 feet above the ground or so, and just flew sort of like right under or above whatever it is, these telephone wires, and their propellers and wings destroyed the phone lines, so that the Egyptians had no idea what was taking place. Here's some maps that show what happens. Look, the basic idea is pretty simple. Israel just needs to drive towards the Suez Canal. Right, they drop paratroopers here at a place called Mitla Pass on the first day. Not really supposed to do anything, but just create the impression that Israel is approaching the canal, which will then force or then provide the pretext for the English and the French. And the Israeli assaults, for the most part, do what they're supposed to do. Right? There are some logistical problems, right? Fighting in Sinai was a complicated thing, and Israel was used to fighting in its own areas. This is different. There were some communication breakdown. There was a sort of controversial attack where Ariel Sharon arguably used his paratroopers, not just on a sort of diversionary force, but to actually try and seize this Egyptian position, which they did, but since it wasn't necessary, arguably cost lives for nothing. But the Israelis did show that they've been learning, but they weren't fully masters yet, but learning the ability to conduct successful combined arms operations, right? They've got air power, they got paratroopers, they've got tank units, they've got infantry, all sort of working together, and at least a reasonable facsimile of what a modern army should do. The real failure is on the French and British side of things. The English do issue their ultimatum, right? We've got to protect the canal. When the Egyptians ignore it, the English and French do destroy the Egyptian Air Force on the ground, carrier-based bombers and fighters. This certainly helps Israel, right? So whatever the Egyptians might have done against Israel, or how they might have done, we don't really know, because as soon as the British and French get involved, Nasser gives the order that the Egyptian army needs to withdraw from Sinai to go back and protect sort of the heartland of Egypt. As part of the agreement for all this, the French had agreed to station French aircraft in Israel itself, because Israelis said, well, listen, if we're going to be attacking in Sinai, we need you guys to protect Tel Aviv and other big cities. So the French Air Force was stationed there. Both the French and Royal Navies began conducting operations against the Egyptian Navy, successfully protecting Israel's coast, and all that's going well. But the fact is, the British and French did not really plan well for this. After World War II, both countries have to economize considerably. They don't have the amphibious craft or the aircraft ready to conduct their operations. And the actual invasion of Egypt is put off by several days. Right, it's supposed to happen October 31st. Doesn't happen until like the 4th. And when it does happen, the real problems start, right? And it's an interesting thing looking at this and looking at Vladimir Putin and the invasion of Ukraine, right? You have former imperial powers who believe they're going to go back to their former colony and assert themselves the way they'd always done before, right? They had a playbook, right? You send in the Army, Navy, Air Force, right? And the British and French had good soldiers. They had commandos, they had paratroopers, Marines, like these were top-notch troops, right? No issues there. They're going to go in and they're going to take over like they've done before. And the power of nationalism, right? The Egyptians aren't going to accept that, right? Instead of accepting, European domination, there are riots, there's military resistance, and most critically, the Egyptians managed to start sinking ships in the Suez Canal, right? Blocking traffic in the canal, to anybody. And most importantly, the Americans and Eisenhower are extremely pissed off. Anybody know what really, really bothered Eisenhower other than the fact that he wasn't told about this?
Oil, probably.
Not even oil at this point.
Not
What
even
else
oil.
is what else is on in the world at the end of October, beginning of November, 1956?
Was it the
The
election?
Hungarian Revolution?
There we go. So understand this. You've got the Soviets who are sending troops into Hungary. You've got a United States which wants to lambast the Soviets in the United Nations, right? Terrible, abusive country, picking on its small neighbors, crushing their national spirit, et cetera, right? And the U.S. is working itself into high dudgeon about this. Meanwhile, right, its most important allies are doing the same thing, right? So Eisenhower is enraged by this, and the English in particular are applying to the United States for a critical loan, which they need or their economy collapses. And Eisenhower basically says, "Listen, you guys really pissed me off. Didn't check with me. I wouldn't have signed off on this." The U.S. is trying its own sort of efforts in the Middle East, and they're called the Baghdad Pact, which is an effort to create sort of a Middle Eastern sort of NATO to resist the Soviets. And in Eisenhower's view, right, the French and the English have undone all the work they're doing on a number of fronts.
Where was Nixon in all this? Eisenhower, or we don't know really.
Palmer House. So Nixon was. I don't think he took a position. LBJ actually, though, came out very strongly in support of Israel. That Eisenhower was ordering the Israelis to withdraw without any sort of preconditions. He wanted Congress to get involved. LBJ came in and said the Democrats are not going to support you, acting heavy-handed with Israel. So Eisenhower got his way because still Eisenhower and so forth. But I don't know that Nixon had anything to add or offer. But in fairness, he was vice president there. And we'll talk about Nixon in '73. And the fact is, he had his reasons for doing what he did. So the former imperial powers were definitely huge losers, right? I mean, this was a tremendous blow to the status of the English and French, a double blow, right? It's a blow because they failed to achieve their goals against Egypt. And it's also a blow because it really highlighted the degree to which they lacked agency at this point, right? These two countries, which had dominated world affairs for a long, long time, were now in a position where they basically had to come to heel when the president of the United States told them to. So this was a blow to their prestige, which, in a lot of ways, sort of they never really recovered from. I mean, for France, particularly coming on the heels of Dien Bien Phu and their withdrawal from Indochina, this is just sort of icing on the cake there. Israel, definitely a winner. Its military performance was not as remarkable as it's going to be later on, but it did a good job. It defeated the largest army in the Arab world, the largest country in the Arab world, and it did get some things out of this, right? Even though there were no preconditions, the United Nations established the UN emergency force along the border between Israel and Egypt, which would provide Israel with a certain degree of security for the next decade. The Egyptians had to open the Straits of Tiran, along with U.S. guarantees that it would support Israeli navigation through it. And a really big thing a couple of years later, right, the French were still siding, right? The French still had their problems in Algeria. They were still close to the Israelis. Successive French governments, left or right, were all still on board with Israel until the early 1960s. And Perez's real big victory, let's say, is getting the French to agree to work with Israel to build a nuclear reactor in Dimona, which, again, well, we may talk about that at some point too. But the real big winner in this is Nasser. Right. And again, in the same way that you can't really sort of overstress the blow to the prestige of the British and the French, you can't overestimate the boost to the prestige of Nasser. And if you think about it, it's a funny thing. If he had just lost to Israel, right, that might have been a humiliating blow to Nasser that he might not have recovered from, right? But the intervention of the British and French changed the whole equation here, right? Nasser was not the guy who lost to Israel. Nasser is the guy who stood up to the British and the French successfully, right, making him the great hero of the Arab world. And in the years that followed, right, his status kept growing and growing. Right? In 1958, Egypt and Syria merged in the United Arab Republic. Again, we'll talk more about that next week. Not great success, but in 58 certainly looked like a big deal. Civil war breaks out in Lebanon in May of 58, in parts driven by Lebanese factions that wanted Lebanon to, right, side along with Nasser and perhaps join the UAR as well. In July of 58, King Faisal of Iraq, the cousin or whatever it is of King Hussein of Jordan, he was assassinated again by quasi-Nasserites. And so by the end of the 1950s, right, for a lot of Arabs, Arab Pan-Arabs, it looked like the moment was coming.
Challenges or celebrations, milestones they hit that they want to share before we start talking about.
I don't know how to respond to that. The dream of the Arabs looked like it was coming true. A unified Arab world under the greatest hero the Arabs had produced in the 20th century, Jamal Abdel Nasser. And spoiler, that's probably not going to be good for Israel, which we'll pick up with next week. And any questions, comments, concerns, I'm happy to address them. If not, I'm equally happy to let you all alone.
Thank you. I appreciated it. Go ahead, though.
Thank you, David, as always.
You're welcome. All right. Have a good night. Thank
Ciao,
you.
You
ciao.
too.
Thank you again.
And Chag Sameach.
Oh, Chag Sameach. Thanks. Bye.